We are going through a series, and I say we, but really you are going through a series. As was introduced, my name is Sean McDonald. I'm from Anchor Community Church, but some of you may have seen me around because I actually share an office at your building over here with Kyle. And so you may have seen my truck in the parking lot, and I've actually shared an office here for about 2 years. But before I had that truck, I had a different truck. And if any vehicle has ever brings up a mixed bag of emotions, that previous vehicle was that for me. And that's because of the origin stories of this other truck that I had. If you've ever bought vehicles from private parties, usually you go on Facebook Marketplace, or if you're responsible, you go to a dealership or something like that, which I did not do. And so this was a few years ago, and before Marketplace, we had this thing called Craigslist. If you're old enough, you may be familiar with Craigslist. So I was on Craigslist looking for vehicles, and this was my first truck that I wanted. It was a Chevy Colorado I was looking at, and I could not find one in the price range that I had budgeted, except for this one truck. This one truck I found fit exactly every bill that I wanted. It was a four-door, four-wheel drive Chevy Colorado with low miles. And I'm like, oh man, this thing is perfect. And it was quite a bit lower in price than what the rest of them in Dubuque were. There's just one catch though. It was in Chicago. So a buddy of mine went with me, and I took out a few $1,000s in cash, and I called the guy and decided to meet him on the south side of Chicago. You can see where this story is going. So my friend and I took the cash, and we went to the south side of Chicago, and we get to the address that he had given us, and it wasn't home or residence. It was like a Walmart parking lot. And so that's the first red flag that I ignored. But I'm already invested. I've driven 3.5 hours, and I'm have in my mind that I need this truck. So we go to the parking lot, and I meet with a guy, and the second red flag goes up. He doesn't even have the truck with him. So he kind of asks us if we're here to buy the truck, and I say yes, and then he says, okay, I'll go get it. I'm thinking, like, why did you not bring it? And so he goes, and about 15 minutes later, he comes back with this white Chevy four-door, four-wheel drive pickup truck. And so my friend and I take it for a test drive, and we drive around, and everything looks pretty good. I could tell they'd done a little body work on the bottom where maybe it had some rust damage. And so I was like, this thing works great. So get the title, sign the title, plunk over the cash, we drive home. And everything seemed great until about 6 weeks later. I get a phone call from the Iowa Department of Transportation. And they ask me, did you just recently purchase a 2009 Chevy Colorado four-door white four-wheel? Yes, I did. And that's when that sinking feeling just came over me. And he says, I'm sorry to tell you, first he asked, how many miles was on the title, and did they say was on the truck? And I said, well, it was like 80,000. He said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, the last time that truck was titled was in Michigan, and it had 220,000 miles on it. And he said that my truck was a part of this odometer rollback scam in South Chicago, where they would buy vehicles in Michigan and bring them into Illinois and retitle them and doctor the title and change the odometer and then try and sell it to people on Craigslist. And so he had, asked me if I had the guy's phone number. Of course, it was like a burner phone, and Craigslist doesn't give you any information, right? So it wasn't at least 2 or 3 weeks later the service engine light comes on as well. And for the next about 1.5 years, it was repair after repair. And it's like the truck was hiding the secret from me too. It waited until I found out that it had over 200,000 miles, and then everything just started to show and fall apart. That was one story of when I've been scammed. Have you ever been scammed? Maybe identity theft or credit card. Maybe you've never been scammed, but have you ever had anyone break any promises to you? You trusted them, and you thought that they trusted you, and then you come to find out that they stabbed you in the back. Maybe you had family or friends not show up when you needed them the most. Maybe you had a husband or wife or relationship walk out on you. Maybe we lower the stakes a little bit. Maybe you had a landlord or tenant who didn't hold up to their part of the agreement. This problem of these broken promises is something that we all feel. We've all experienced one way or another, either real high stakes or maybe some lower stakes, but we've all recognized this brokenness in our world. And our culture likes to talk a lot about the promises people have broken against us, but we talk very little about the ways that we've broken promises with other people, that we've been the perpetrators of harm and pain caused to other people. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. But what this does in our culture is it creates a culture of fear and isolation and absence. It's like if you've ever thrown a party and you invite a bunch of people to come and no one shows up. It doesn't take too many times of doing that before you just stop throwing parties. You stop putting yourself out there and you find it easier just to stay at home and watch Netflix and order a pizza. And you don't put yourself out there anymore because you've been burned too many times. We become secluded, hiding in our homes, watching shows about community, maybe even titled Friends, and we find ourselves without any. But this is not how our world is supposed to be. This is not how God created things. So what does Jesus have to say about broken promises? What does Jesus have to say to the church? We're going to be looking at that this morning. You guys are going through this series called Converting the Church, and you're looking at the 7 woes to the Pharisees, where Jesus is telling the religious leaders in specific ways of which that they've failed to live out the expectations that God had for them and how they're supposed to follow God. And so what we're going to do this morning is first we're going to unpack what did this mean to them, and then we're going to look at what does this mean for us. So open your Bibles if you have them with you. If you have a phone, scroll to Matthew 23. We're going to be looking at verses 16 through 22. It says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound to that oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it's nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he's bound by this oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it." Now, Jesus is using pretty strong language here this morning. He's calling them blind guides and fools. And later on, after the woes, we'll see him call them serpents. Now, this woe thing, you guys have been looking at the woes of the Pharisees. What is a woe? This is not something that we use in our regular English vernacular here in Dubuque. In 2024, I don't go to you and say, "Woe are you." But this woe is part of a prophetic tradition. About 700 years before Jesus came, a prophet named Isaiah used this type of communication to his nation to say, look out, listen up. You guys are not doing things right. That's what this woe is. And in the way we read it from Jesus, it seems almost like he's casting judgment, but really the idea of a woe is just telling you, look out, because judgment is coming. It's the natural consequence of what you're doing, whether it's by God or whether just through the way God has set up the world. But if you continue on the way that you're doing, you are going to suffer for it. Jesus is also mad because this is a justice issue. This is tied to the social fabric of their society and some of the problems that were being perpetuated by the leaders at that time. And so what were they doing? What were these oaths that they were taking? It seems that they were creating some sort of elaborate system that they were swearing by religious symbols. Why were they doing this? Well, they're trying to borrow the authority of God to make their promises sound more weighty. It was almost as if they're taking God and saying, God's on my side. He's telling you to trust me because I'm swearing by the gold in the temple or the sacrifice on the altar, these religious symbols, so that way you'll trust me. But then they were taking this intricate system of what was bound and what was not bound, and then using it to cheat and defraud one another. And this is one of the reasons that Jesus is very upset. But he's also upset because they're using God and calling God into the situation. And saying it's not just that you're cheating one another, you're actually implicating God in his holy things in your cheating of one another. Now, in our culture, we don't usually swear by religious symbols. We don't walk around and say, I swear by New Life Church that I'm going to, keep my end of the bargain. But we do hear kids on the playground or other people say, like, I swear to God, right? Or on my mama's life, things like that to raise the stakes, to tell people how serious they are, that they're going to, play on your kickball team or not get you back and tag. So what do we do as adults in our culture? Well, sometimes people use profanity, actually, to raise the stakes, to say, I'm serious about this. I really saw this, or I'm really going to do this. They're trying to raise the intensity of their promise. And what's really interesting is if you think about profanity, and a lot of times we call it swear words, the definition is actually to swear an oath or using these words in oath swearing. That's why we call them swear words. Most of us don't think about it that way. And so this is what we do in our culture sometimes to take some sort of authority or to raise the stakes. So what's going on in this passage about some things meaning nothing and other things being bound? Well, basically, they're trying to sound serious, but trying to create loopholes so that the way they were not legally or socially bound to the commitment that they had made. And so the Pharisees are trying to say that, well, if I swear by the temple, that's not binding. But if I swear by the gold of the temple. And so many theologians and pastors and writers have tried to figure out, like, what are the rules of this game that the Pharisees were playing? And no one really knows because this is really the only place that it's recorded that this type of logic is happening. Some of the theologians guess that it has to do with this word korban, or things devoted to God. And we see in another place Jesus is reprimanding the Pharisees because children were not taking care of their parents as they got older and elderly. And the money that those kids had, instead of helping their parents, they would say, oh no, my money is actually devoted to God. It's korban. It's devoted to God, so I'm sorry, Mom and Dad, I know you're elderly, you can't earn a living anymore, but I've already given these things to God, so you're kind of on your own. This is a society without Medicare, without Social Security, without welfare, without any other types of supports. And so if you're going to leave your parents on their own because you're giving these things to God, Jesus is saying, that is not right. God doesn't want those things. He wants you to help your parents. It seems like this is kind of similar of what's going on here. There were certain things that use this word that were devoted to God. Some speculate it's the gold in the temple, maybe the treasury, and the sacrifices on the altar that were devoted to God. But it doesn't really matter because Jesus says their logic is flawed. So whatever their logic was, it doesn't really matter for the meaning of this passage. Because Jesus said, whatever rules you're making are stupid. They're not right. They're not what you should be doing. These are terrible logic. And so Jesus corrects that logic, specifically in verses 19 through 22. And he uses an argument called the lesser to the greater, where the Pharisees have almost flipped this. They're saying the thing that's greater, the temple, is not bound, but the thing that's lesser, the gold of the temple, like just a piece of that, is bound. And Jesus is saying, like, well, this doesn't make any sense anyways on a logical thing, because the gold, what makes that holy? Well, it's because it's temple gold. The temple is what makes it holy. So you can't say that the gold is binding and the temple is not, because the temple is even greater than the gold. And same with the sacrifice on the altar. What makes that sacrifice holy? It's because it's on the altar to God, not because of that animal or that bird or that wheat or whatever they're sacrificing. It's because the altar is holy. And then he ends by saying, you say you're swearing by heaven. If you're swearing by heaven, you're swearing by him who dwells in heaven. And Jesus is saying, this is really serious. These vows that you're taking, these promises you're making to people are very serious. You can't just make up some hypothetical rules like on the schoolyard and just say that, oh, well, I was crossing my fingers. I'm actually not going to buy that field from you. Or, you know what? I'm not going to repay that loan because I actually swore by the altar, not the sacrifice on the altar. Gotcha. No, Jesus is saying this is terrible. And so he's not just correcting their logic, which he is, but he's also going deeper. He's really talking about their heart. Because if Jesus was just correcting the logic, he would be teaching them how to swear correctly and saying, you should just, I know you're doing it by this thing, but actually do it by that, but continue on making oaths and swearing and things like that. No, he's talking about their hearts because they were cheating people and defrauding others. And you can see that this is a justice issue both then and now. Anytime you make some sort of legal contract or any of agreement, why would you back out of that? Because it's no longer advantageous for you. Maybe something has changed. It's easy to keep commitments and promises when the deal has stayed the same. When there's no other factors and someone messages you on Marketplace and you're selling a couch and they say, I'll give you $100. You say, okay, great. But then someone messages you, said, I'll give you $120 for it. Someone else says, I'll give you $150. Now there's other offers on the table. So now we're tempted to say, well, did I really say I was going to sell it to you for $100? Right? Or, well, I didn't say I was going to hold it, like you didn't show up, and we try and create all these other things to get out of the deal. But it's because we are looking out for ourselves, and we're not concerned with the other person. And our integrity has been compromised because we're now going back on our word. Now, those are really low stakes, right? Selling a dirty couch on Marketplace. But what about other things in our lives? What about relationships? What about business deals? Some of you know how devastating this can be if you're in sales or if you're in some sort of business agreement. And you go out and you say you're going to buy this field and the person says he's going to sell it to you, and maybe at this time this is some things that were happening, and then you go out and you spend the rest of your money on seed and hiring workers and all sorts of things to get this thing, and then the deal falls apart. What does that do? You're hosed. Now you don't have the field, but you've bought all the seed and you've hired these workers. You can't get that money back. You're defrauding one another. It's at the expense of other people that we break our commitments. And this is really the heart of what Jesus is trying to correct. And this is why his language is so strong to these religious leaders. Why he calls them blind guides. Why he calls them serpents. Because these are the people of their culture who are supposed to be setting the ethical standard for the whole country, for all of society, you would be looking to the Pharisees and the religious leaders to know what is right and wrong. And what were they doing? They were teaching other people to defraud one another. They were teaching other people, if you put in this specific language in the contract, you don't have to fulfill it. If you cross your fingers, you don't have to keep that promise. And of all people who should be marked by integrity and honesty, it should be the religious leaders. So what does this mean for us? Most of us don't swear by the gold of the courthouse downtown, right? The gold roof on the top. You're not making an agreement and you say, I swear by the gold on the courthouse. And if that is you, please stop. That's just weird. I don't know why you would be doing this, but everyone thinks you're crazy. But what do we do? How does this apply to us? Do we make commitments and not follow through with them? Do we back out of agreements because we've found a better deal? And this is always at someone's expense, whether it's financially or emotionally. Or do we intentionally not commit in order to keep our options open? I'm not going to commit to serving in this nonprofit downtown at the Dream Center or the Mission or the Clarity Clinic or something like that because there may be something better that comes along and I want to be a part of that something better. Or maybe I don't commit to help out with children's ministry or worship or something like that at the local church because what if I want to sleep in? Or what if there's a new church that opens up that has a more dynamic speaker or a praise band that has an even better sound? And I don't want to put my stake here because I want to keep my options open and go somewhere else. Your friends ask you to help them move. And most of us don't like helping people move. But you do it and you make a commitment. Not because you want to, but because you want to be there for that person. And sometimes something better comes along. Another friend says, hey, you know what? We're going to go out and we're going to go have pizza and we're going to go down and watch the football game. Well, now you've got a decision. Did you commit to that friend? Say that you would help them move? Or are you going to say, you know what? Something came up. I can't help out. And you ditch that so that way you can do something better. And you leave that person high and dry. It's interesting. On first reading, you may read this passage and think Jesus is really beating up on them for making commitments and not keeping them. And we don't do that too much. But we'll just not make commitments at all. But the root of both of those is selfishness. It's to not make commitments is not a correction. It's actually an error just in the opposite direction. Because you're still looking out for yourself. You're still trying to say, what's best for me is what I'm going to do. Regardless of the ramifications it has on other people, I want to keep my options open. And if it doesn't serve me anymore, if something better comes along, then I'm just going to leave it. Author and writer David Brooks, who wrote a book called Two Mountains, says this about our society. He says, we live in a society that celebrates freedom, that tells us to be true to ourselves at the expense of surrendering to a cause, rooting ourselves in a neighborhood, binding ourselves to others by social solidarity and love. We've taken individualism to the extreme, and in the process, we've torn the social fabric in 1,000 ways. The path to repair is through making deeper commitments. He argues in the book that radical individualism in our culture is actually what's creating isolation and loneliness, why so many people are struggling with loneliness and relationships. And his correction is actually to make deeper commitments, to root yourself in a community, to root yourself in a single relationship with a significant other, to root yourself in a career, And to do these things actually help you grow. It's for your spiritual formation. So what does this teaching mean for me? Well, I'm kind of like a pastor, kind of like Kyle, and so there's parts of my jobs that are uncomfortable sometimes. People call or people want to have meetings, and it's difficult because you either have to be honest with them and tell them something that they don't want to hear, or sometimes people are just hard, right? Maybe you work in a job and you work with people that are difficult. And sometimes I tend to avoid those conversations. I tend to put off those emails and phone calls. And I procrastinate the parts of my job that I don't like. But I've made a commitment to be serving in this role at my church. And so I need to follow through with that commitment, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's difficult. I've also made commitments in my relationship. I'm married, my wife is here, and I've made commitments to certain things. And so one of the commitments that we've made is to be radically honest with one another. That sounds great on the surface. But if you've been in a relationship and you realize that you've failed in a number of ways, or maybe you struggle with pornography or lying or just being absent and not relationally there, you realize that sometimes, to be honest, it's really difficult and painful and embarrassing. But that's one of the commitments I've made in my life, so I continually work to try and fulfill this commitment. So how would my life look different if I was able to fulfill all of my commitments? And how would your life look different if you fulfilled all of your commitments? Well, we would show up for someone when they needed us. We would show up when someone is hurt and lonely. And we'd be able to be the physical embodiment of God's hands and feet to one another. Maybe it looks like a warm hug when they're hurting, or maybe it's just moving some boxes on a cold winter day when they need help moving. But we get to be a part of bringing heaven to earth, even if it's just for a moment. And if we're known by others as dependable, our friends would know that they can depend on us. People at church would know that when we tell them we're coming, we'll be there. Or if we'll help out, we'll do it. Or if we'll send that email or make that phone call or loan them the money or pay back the money. Wouldn't that be great if we lived in a world, in a community, that we all kept our commitments? How would our community change and look different? Both at New Life and in Dubuque and in our country, if we were able to trust one another and follow through with all of our commitments. There'd be very few lawsuits, legal battles, divorces. Politicians would always deliver on their promises. And we'd be able to trust our leaders, both local and nationally. Our friends would show up. We'd follow up with them. We'd care for one another. Parents would make it to their kids' baseball games. Spouses could leave their phones unlocked without concern. And I would have peace knowing that I'm right in relationship with one another, with God. And so I don't know how this message is hitting you this morning. I don't know if maybe the complexity of the temple structure and the oaths are distracting, or whether you're seeing the heart of this. And this is about keeping promises, about being people of integrity, people who make commitments and keep them. So I want to take just a moment and leave it open for the Spirit to whether convict, to show, maybe to heal some brokenness. So let's take a moment of silence just to ask the Spirit to come and tell us how this applies to us. So I'd ask you to close your eyes for just a moment, and we'll take just a minute here. Father, we come to you this morning, broken people, Father, who may have had many promises broken to us. And we've seen examples in our friends or family or job places of that. This is what it means, is just part of life, that we just take whatever the better thing is that comes along. We don't keep our commitments. But Father, I pray that you would give us a new vision of what it looks like and what it means to keep our promises and oaths. Father, I pray that you would give us conviction this morning, that you would show us the big things, the little things. Father, anything in our life that we're not fulfilling that commitment. I pray that you would make us people of integrity. That when we come to you, you don't bring us woes, but you bring us words of well done, good and faithful servant. Father, help us to be a people who love one another and love you. So be with us this morning. In Christ's name we pray.